very often when you're arguing the case against governments and in favor of an anarchic system or decentralized system of social order, there's a whole cavalcade of arguments that are going to be raised against you. A lot of them focus on who's going to provide the various goods and services that are associated to one degree or another with states. Usually because states have monopolized them, people assume, well, if they do them and the state didn't exist, then those goods and services would not exist. There's arguments about, well, maybe anarchy could work, but it would be suboptimal compared to states. There's arguments about general chaos. There's a lot of things that people like to say. But let's say that you are persuasive and that you have good arguments, that you're able to uh, express how it might work and why list all the failures of governments and why they're bad and the incentive problem and the economic calculation problem and whatnot. A lot of people are going to still come to the conclusion, and not unreasonably, to say, look, that all sounds great. It makes sense when you talk about it. It sounds theoretically, persuasive, if not definitive. But if I look at a map of the world, I can see that it's covered in states, that there are states everywhere, that with a few exceptions, human society is completely run by states, that they exist, like, they're almost ubiquitous. Like, so isn't that evidence that they are uh, necessary for human society? And the fact that they've spread, the fact that they have taken over the world, so to speak, isn't that evidence that they are superior? They're an optimal form of human organization. And I think that although there's some logical problems with that line of argument, it's certainly understandable. It's certainly plausible for someone to have that intuition if they look at the map. But there's a couple problems with it also. And one of them is, and I think the most important one, is that correlation does not equal causation. And the fact that something proliferates doesn't mean that it's beneficial or optimal, right? So the fact that states are all over the world and that most humans live under the control of one state or another to some degree at least, doesn't prove that states are the best way to organize or that states are necessarily good things. There are lots of things that proliferate that we readily acknowledge are not good things. Pretty much every disease. Nobody looks at a widespread disease, and like herpes, for instance, and says, "Oh yeah, herpes is great because it's everywhere, because it's very common, because whatever 25% of people have it." And what's more, people wouldn't say that not only is it great, but that it's optimal. Like that the best system to have is to have herpes. People wouldn't argue that, and that's an analogy, but it would be true for human social institutions. People wouldn't look at organized crime and say, well, organized crime is or just crime generally. These are things that happen everywhere. Every society that we have evidence of has murders and has rapes and burglary and fraud and all this. You wouldn't then conclude that, well, we need these things for society to exist, or that make society optimal in some sense. You would just acknowledge, well, that's a type of expropriation, that's a type of crime that's happening that is incentivized in the situation that human society finds itself in to exist, but that doesn't mean that human society needs that. And there's other arguments that you could raise. One is that cartography, if you look at a map, is often very misleading. You draw a line on a landmass and you say, this state, and it gives the impression that that state in that area has complete control and complete influence and is accountable for everything that happens in that territory. And the truth of that varies tremendously from state to state and region to region. There are many places, even still today in the world, where the existence of a state is quite nominal, that it's questionable, where the people are not essentially being taxed, that they're not being regulated, that they may not even be aware of the state that supposedly rules over them. And so in that situation, it would be wrong to say that states have perpetuated everywhere. But this becomes even more true if we go back in time, because it is true that right now states are as popular as they've ever been. This is the era of states, and it has been the era of states for probably 300 or 400 years, possibly more. But the farther you go back in history, the higher the percentage of the population that could be said to be living outside of a state. And if we go back far enough, we get to the point where nobody lived under a state. And there's some quibbling that could be made here about what counts as a state and when does something become a state. But most historians would agree, and anthropologists and archaeologists would agree, that the first states arose in Mesopotamia, in Uruk probably, or around there, in the southern part of Mesopotamia, in around 3100 BCE, maybe slightly thereafter in Egypt or at the same time, and a few hundred years later in China, around the same time in the Indus River Valley, a little bit later in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean like Greece, and then much later in places like Northern Europe and the Americas. And this raises some interesting questions, because in the debates about the efficacy of states, invariably people bring up all these things like the free rider problem and the positive externalities and negative externalities and the prisoner's dilemma and all these issues. They say, look, these are problems, these are theoretical problems, and the state is a solution. And some people would say the only solution, and others would say, I think in a more nuanced position, the best solution that we have, not necessarily a perfect solution, but better than the alternatives. Although I think most of the people in the debate just kind of argue that, no, if you don't have a state, then it's just impossible. It's the only possible. I think this is interesting, because if that were true, then they should proliferate everywhere immediately. There's no reason that if indeed states are the best and only solution to the free rider problem, and if they provide superior social organization and are so advantageous, then why were they so few and far between early on, right? Why were the people in Uruk have states, but then not people even 50 miles away in the Iranian plateau or in Anatolia? We see that, and this is less clear today, and I think that's an interesting question why that maybe I'll address later. But the first states seemed, not just seemed, they were restricted to very, very specific conditions, and those conditions were irrigated farming in diluvial floodplains. All right, they didn't exist for nomads, they didn't exist for pastoralists, they didn't exist for semi-sedentary people, they didn't even exist for agriculturalists who planted certain crops like cassava or potatoes or sweet potatoes, or the various types of fruity like almonds, peanuts. It was grains, barley, wheat, rice, and that's a very interesting fact. Why would they not, like, if having a king, to reference the early types of states, if having a king was so advantageous, why wouldn't the pastoralists have one? Why wouldn't the nomads have one? Why wouldn't the people who practiced so-called dry agriculture that's not based on irrigation but on rainfall, why would it only be in the irrigated lands? And I think that the clear answer, or the most likely answer, if not the clear answer, maybe that's too strong a word, is that states were only possible in areas that were like that. And here I'm going to reference a book that I read a few weeks ago. Shout out to Ivan the Heathen for alerting me to this book. He told me about it last fall. I ordered it and read it. It's a very good book called Against the Grain, The Deep History of the Early States. Let's see it here. And it is not long. It's an easy read. I think I read it in 2 or 3 sittings, moderately length sittings, so something that you can go through pretty quick. And it points out that, strangely enough, the only time states have existed is when it was logistically possible and cost effective to tax people. All right, so like if you have a nomadic culture or a pastoralist culture where wealth is mobile or not easily excludable, then establishing a system of taxation is impossible, uh, at least in early time. Now, this may have changed with technological innovations, especially with the rise of money. I think that money may have made this more complicated. But initially, the only way to tax was if you had people who were settled, who couldn't move, who had infrastructure that they couldn't readily abandon, and it even had to be specific types of crops. For instance, potatoes or yams, or the tubers, the various tubers that grow under the ground. Um, when you look at a field of those, you can't readily tell how much is there. So the tax assayer can't come and say, okay, I can look at your potato field, I know how much you owe in taxes. He would have to literally go and dig out all of the tubers to come up with a count. And that would entail him doing about as much work as the farmer would have to do, plus the tubers are very heavy, so it's not very cost effective to move them. There's other things like peanuts and some of the other legumes. They bloom all year, and so that's very difficult because you don't know when to go assess the taxes. If you have someone with an almond orchard, they could be getting almonds or peanuts all year, and it's only really cost effective if everything ripens at the same time, and you can go and say, okay, we know that this month of the year, on this day or week, this is when we'll be able to assess taxes. And so much less as a beneficial form of social organization, it is a type of expropriation that is only possible under certain conditions. And the book is quite interesting because it goes into how we just assume, well, it must have been great because they have these big cities and people were living there, and so they obviously were superior. And it's like these cities collapsed repeatedly, probably mostly for ecological and demographic problems. Sorry, epidemiological issues. The first cities would have probably had recurrent plagues that were probably worse than the ones that we saw in the New World after the Columbian Exchange. You were first getting a lot of domesticated animals and lots of people living in close proximity. You also had a lot of ecological change. But it's very clear, the first records that we have of these first states is that they were constantly in need of bringing new people there. That they would fight wars of conquest where the chief form of plunder would not be new land, but it would be people. That people would be brought back as slaves, and that they had all kinds of laws to prevent people from leaving. That it was very much like an early but much more brutal enclosure movement. The people were not necessarily coming to these places as beacons in a dark world and finding them to be very valuable. They were forced to go there, and that when political power evaporated or when ecological conditions got bad, people would simply revert, if you want to use that term, to other forms of lifestyle. And many of these early states collapsed only to reemerge, sometimes hundreds of years later, and to collapse again. And that it's very difficult to say, well, this is clearly just an optimal form of social organization that people developed as a solution to the various problems. And the other problem I really have with that argument, the state is a solution to these problems, it kind of posits that, like, in the pre-state days, whenever they were, pre-state people got together and they said Jesus, or, well, they wouldn't have said Jesus, but we have these problems, and why don't we form a state to solve those problems? Let's all get together and decide as a people. And the terms used almost make it sound like this would be a unanimous thing, or at the very least a majoritarian election, and establish a state. And we just don't have any evidence that that's how states arose. If we read the proclamations of the early rulers, and my favorite example here is Narmer, the supposed first pharaoh of Egypt who united Upper and Lower Egypt. He does not present himself as a person solving social problems or solving the free rider problem or anything like that, or even doing the most good for the most people. He presents himself as an egotistical conqueror who is out to aggrandize himself and who who views his subjects not as citizens that he needs to cherish and that he is burdened with providing services for them and providing a function that is necessary, but he sees as chattel, as his property to be used as he sees fit, to be abused even. And some of the statuary is quite striking, like literally, because the pose is him like smiting people with his mace, and the people could be his political enemies, but they could just as easily be his subjects. And some of the statuary in ancient Egypt even included the pharaoh with his feet atop the faces and bodies of his people. And if that's the evidence that we have about their motivations, and it's possible, like, oh, maybe the Narmer palette is full of shit, and maybe it really wasn't like that, but there's no evidence that it was some kind of consensual social contract that was dreamed up and worked out, and people say, hey, we have these problems, we want to do these, maybe we want to do these infrastructure irrigation channels, and we just can't figure out a way to make it work, so let's have a king. There's no evidence that's what happened. What happened is you get a situation, and Azar talks about this in his book on war, that when you're confronted with taxation, you have the option of either resisting and risking death, and or submitting and just saying, I'm just going to take it. I'm just going to take it. And whether you do those two things depends on your temperament. It also depends tremendously on the circumstances. And for many, many, many people over history, they've opted to resist, and historically, very often successfully. People would, and this is especially true with certain types of societies. If you're nomadic, if you're pastoralist, if you have dry farming, if there's technological things that nullify whatever advantages the state has, this tends to happen quite a bit, actually. On the other hand, when people submit, that is not an indication that the state then is optimal, or that they want the state, or that they need the state. It's just an indication that they would rather submit than to die in a brutal struggle that they have, low odds in their estimation of winning. Or even if they think they have good odds of winning, they think that the costs of fighting are less than the costs of the expropriation. So I think that it's more likely that states did not arise as solutions to social problems, which they really don't seem to solve anyway, but as a type of expropriation that only exists under certain conditions. If you have certain types of crops, if you have certain types of a technological plateau or whatever. Now, you could argue, well, that sounds great, but obviously states exist places now that are not based on irrigation agriculture, and doesn't their spread indicate that they're beneficial? And you could say, look, they've sure, maybe it is a form of expropriation and exploitation, but then they conquered all the other areas, and so doesn't that show that they're advantageous? Well, there's two things to say about that. One is that it may show that they're good at conquering, right? If you can expropriate from the people in your society, then you can accumulate an offensive striking power that you might not have otherwise, and this could allow you to spread. Although non-state societies have repeatedly been able to do that as well. Non-state societies has often been able to prey upon state societies quite readily, including relatively recently, and including some of the biggest, most powerful states that have ever existed falling prey to this. But the other thing is that as technology changes, what the state is able to cost-effectively expropriate has changed as well. So in a pre-monetary economy, when everything is based in kind, you have to have certain types of crops. If you went into areas where those crops didn't grow, then states were basically impossible. And they indeed were impossible. They didn't exist outside of those well-defined areas. Once you start getting into a money economy, it's based on species, taxation becomes more cost-effective for a variety of activities that before weren't. And I think this is not an area that I claim to know everything about. I can't give a definitive answer here or an exhaustive one, and I think an exhaustive answer would actually be extremely long, and you'd have to cover all the different periods and everything. But I think that it's along those lines. As technology has changed, states have been able to take advantage of that. And there's evidence, especially in the early states, that they did everything they could to proliferate the means of their own subsistence. So they would try and bring more land under irrigation. They would try and bring more people under their control. Um, Actually, the book is interesting because he talks about there's a possibility that humans are in some sense domesticated, that we see a change in animals when they become domesticated. They become smaller, they become less intelligent, their birth rate goes up, uh, and a lot of that has happened with humans. And he doesn't come out and say it. He says it's an interesting idea, but the evidence is not, it hasn't been proven yet, and it's difficult to even develop a rubric that would show it, because it's unlike with dogs and wolves, where we have a clear taxonomy between a wild wolf and a domesticated dog, or a wild Uruk and a domesticated cow. We don't have that for humans at this point, so it's hard to make that direct comparison. But it is clear states look at things like, what can we tax? If we can tax X, then try and make X as common as possible. Spread X at the expense of Y and Z, which are things that we can't tax effectively. And I mean, there's explicit evidence to that effect in the early states and subsequently. And even today, you know, whenever you hear someone talk about the Laffer curve, or people say, well, tax revenue will go up if we do X, there you go. Now, the wet dream here of the crypto anarchists would be, yes, technology has allowed states to spread, and what we've seen is the rise of the Industrial Revolution gave states the ability to proliferate in a way that they hadn't. You know, up until modern times, it was very, very difficult for states to spread into non-agricultural areas. You know, so even China, you know, the quintessential state in a lot of ways, one of the longest, most enduring states, had a very hard time extending itself into the Asian steppe and the Gobi Desert, in areas where agriculture was not impossible, even where agriculture was impossible, despite the fact that these areas were relatively close to the main population centers of China. And it's even true, you know, in the United States. It was relatively difficult for the American state to really exert itself into the Great Plains. And it was only with the Industrial Revolution that suddenly there was a technological advance that made this possible or practical, right? But it's interesting that they only exist where it's practical to tax, where it's practical to expropriate in this way. As soon as the ability to tax is more difficult than the ability to simply create the wealth in the first place, then the incentive for states to exist goes away. And this is kind of the wet dream of the crypto anarchists, the Bitcoin people, the Bitcoin Cash, all those. Whether or not those technologies will be sufficient to where I'll actually realize that end is, you know, a totally hypothetical question that I can't answer. I think it has that potential, but the odds I wouldn't want to lay. Probably low in the short term, longer in the long term. But technological advance is not something that you know, you can hang your hat on and just assume that it's going to either benefit or not benefit the state. It could do either. Like historically, it's gone either way in a number of cases. So, yeah. So I mean, that's a very good book. I would recommend it. It's short. The author also wrote a book called The Art of Not Being Governed, which is about societies in Southeast Asia that are essentially stateless, where you have people who live, and nominally they might be part of Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam, but essentially they are doing their own thing and totally free of state power anyway. Not totally free in like the abstract sense necessarily, but totally free of state power. But I think it is a careful reading, and you know, my first intuition as a studying reading history has been, if you look at the motives of political leaders, of the heads of states, and this is, I think, better illustrated with monarchs, but it's still true with democracies too, I would argue, that they're motivated, they have selfish motivations. And often it's blatantly wealth and power, but other times it's more subtle things. They want to be famous, they want to be well regarded, they want to have status. But it's a stretch to say, well, obviously they're just there to help everyone, that they're altruistic, and that they are motivated by a zeal for making the world a better place or providing some linchpin to society. Granted, they have a lot of rhetoric that they invoke to claim that. But that doesn't, it's not enough for them to just assert, hey, I'm ruling over you for your own benefit. They have to provide convincing evidence to that effect. And the reason I became an anarchist is because I didn't find that evidence very convincing, right? Yes, they're spread, they're very common, but so is herpes, and the big difference is that herpes doesn't run the public schools. So anyway, those are just my thoughts. I think it is a good book. It's not very expensive, so if you're interested, check it out, and I will talk to you all another day. Bye-bye.